In the late 16th century, the Dutch and the English decided to join in naval activities in the Indian Ocean as well, countering the supremacy of the Portuguese. After initial forays into the region, merchants from both decided to come together and form the English and the Dutch East India Companies respectively. They started out in Southeast Asia around Malacca, where the English were welcomed by the local Sultan to counter the growing influence of the Portuguese. The English then made their way to Java, where they found themselves in competition with the Dutch. Now, in Java, you had islands which were the only sources of cloves and nutmegs in the world, which made them very valuable. The English and the Dutch engaged in a lot of active conflict over these islands, with the Dutch eventually defeating the English and committing genocide of local populations in order to maintain their control. The initial focus of the English on Southeast Asia changed. So, in the beginning, when they were trading with Southeast Asia, the English had nothing to offer in return, which resulted in them sacrificing a lot of their gold reserves. Later, they realized that the Southeast Asians demanded Indian cotton, which meant that they could make a lot of money by engaging in intra-Asian trade. Chennai, Bombay, and Kolkata were occupied as trading settlements and then later turned into fortified cities. The French also got in on the act over here and created outposts along the coast, the most famous of which is Pondicherry. The Danes tried doing the same but were unsuccessful in doing so. Though the companies established themselves well fairly soon, they were unable to make good profits because they also had to allow their merchants to engage in private trade to make up for the meager salaries that they paid the merchants. Additionally, piracy was often allowed for and endorsed by different European monarchs to intervene in their opposition's trade, though overall the pirates, who operated out of Madagascar, tended to create problems for all parties involved, including the Mughals. Now, one of the major developments of the 17th century was the declining role of the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean. This happened partly because of the rise of other European powers, but also partly because local kings learned to deal with their military tactics. They were defeated in Persia by the local Sultan and were kicked out of Oman as well. In India, the Mughals and the Marathas squeezed them out and they were relegated to being pirates in certain parts of the subcontinent. Briefly, they took over Sri Lanka, but in 1638, the Sinhalese joined hands with the Dutch to expel the Portuguese from there as well. In doing so, though, the Sinhalese then paved the way for the Dutch to take over as their colonial masters. Now, the Dutch tried to use this increased influence in the region to then make inroads along the Indian coast. They were successful in doing so for a bit, but were stopped by Martanda Varma, who was a Nair prince. Now, Martanda Varma didn't believe in making alliances, and so instead he created a very strong army for himself and took over neighbouring kingdoms. In 1741, he met the Dutch at the Battle of Kolachel, where he actually defeated them, and this marks a very crucial point in the fortunes of the Dutch in the Indian Ocean, which went into a steady decline from there on. While the Dutch were being defeated in Travancore, the Portuguese and the English were facing stiff resistance from the Marathas. Now, the Marathas under Kanhoji Angre had developed a strong navy that were able to counter the English and allied European forces for quite some time. Kanhoji Angre's descendants kept up this resistance, but eventual infighting amongst the Marathas would help the East India Company a great deal. By the mid-18th century, the Portuguese and the Dutch were fading away in the Indian Ocean, and the English had established themselves as the strongest force. At the same time, though, they still only operated out of coastal areas and began moving inland only after the French did so. The French and the English then started using local rivalries to suit their own ends, and in the conflict that ensued, the English eventually won, further strengthening their hold over the subcontinent. Despite this, though, the British were far from masters of India at the time. The Marathas and other local kings kept challenging them all the way to the mid-19th century. Now, one of the most famous of these local kings was Tipu Sultan from Mysore. In popular memory, he is depicted as a patriot for the stiff resistance that he provided to the British, though within his own kingdom he crushed dissent and forced conversions on a number of people. He later marched on Kerala and did the same. He eventually was defeated by an alliance between the British and local kingdoms surrounding him, and he tried hard to find allies to counter this, even trying to find allies in Europe in the form of Napoleon and other kings, but unsuccessfully so. The Dutch were losing their influence in the Indian Ocean by the end of the 18th century, but they still controlled Sri Lanka and parts of Southeast Asia. They very fiercely protected seedlings of nutmegs and cloves in order to maintain their hold on parts of the spice trade, But after these were smuggled out by the French in the late 18th century, the Dutch East India Company went into a rapid decline and eventually dissolved in 1799. Now, this wasn't the only form of economic espionage that was going on in the Indian Ocean. You had the British taking Indian textile technology back to England and mass producing textiles with this technology, thereby crippling the Indian market in the process. The English East India Company was facing a problem though. They were taking over large parts of the subcontinent, but didn't have the corresponding profits to show for it, because a large part of the wealth that they received went to the private merchants. Only trade with China was profitable for them, but even this was problematic because the Chinese demanded payments in silver, which then caused a precious metal shortage for the British. They found their answer in opium. Now, the Chinese used to originally only use opium for its medicinal purposes, but in the 18th century onwards, they also began to smoke it recreationally. The British realized that they could supply the growing demand by forcing its cultivation in India. They sold cheap mill-made textiles to the Indians and bought opium from them at artificially low prices, which they then exchanged for Chinese goods. They ran into problems in Southeast Asia as well. Most of their trade used to pass through the Strait of Malacca, which at the time was controlled by the Dutch, which led them to constantly fear intervention. At the time in Europe when Napoleon was defeating the Dutch, the British saw a golden opportunity and took over the Dutch territories in Southeast Asia. Later though, when Napoleon was defeated in Europe, the British realized that they would have to give back the Dutch these territories. Before doing so though, they converted Singapore into a free port, thereby taking care of their geopolitical concerns and ensuring a free trade route with China. Also during the Napoleonic Wars, they took over the Dutch territories in Sri Lanka. These territories though were restricted to the coastal areas, and the British still wanted to take over the central areas, which were controlled by the South Indian Nayak dynasty that were based out of Kandy. Now, initially their attempts in 1803 to take over these areas were unsuccessful, but a little over a decade later, infighting amongst the locals weakened them, and so the British were able to in fact take over these areas in 1815. Back in China though, they were facing fresh opium related trouble. Their monopoly over the opium trade crashed when other countries began supplying the product. You had prices fall because of this, and opium addiction spread across China. The Chinese king was actually forced to ban the consumption of opium because of this widespread addiction, and thereby threatening British economic interests even further. The British in return launched an attack on China, defeating the Manchu Empire and forcing them to open the ports for trade and also pay reparations as well. Tensions arose again in 1856, though this time the British had to wait before retaliating because the Revolt of 1857 was just beginning in India. Eventually though, the Second Opium War was fought with French and American aid, and the Chinese Imperial Army was finally defeated in 1860. Following the Revolt of 1857, the East India Company was forced to hand over control of India to the British Crown. Its commercial activities were taken over by a host of other private firms. For the most part, throughout history, Indian commercial interests had always been harmed by British activities, though at this time you see a few Indians become wealthy as a result of this. In particular, you see the Parsi community benefiting greatly. They migrated to Bombay at the time that it became the center of commerce, and they became a vital part of supply chains and trade networks. People like Jamshedji Jijiboy, David Sassoon, and Premchand Raichand are examples of people who became extremely wealthy at this point. Away from India, in the Persian Gulf, geopolitics were changing once again. Omanis had evicted the Portuguese in the 1700s, but at this time were facing a fresh threat in the form of the Persians under Nadir Shah. The Omanis then joined hands with the British to counter the Persians, and with the support of the British, built a large naval fleet that allowed them to establish a maritime empire from the east coast of Africa till the Makran coast. This economic growth was driven by African slave trade and trade in cloves. African slave trade later though was abolished under pressure from the British, who themselves no longer had need for this because they had a cheap supply of indentured labour from India, and domestically through the Industrial Revolution had reduced their dependence on labour. The dynamics of interaction in the Indian Ocean region changed quite significantly in the 19th century because of the development of coal-powered trains and steam ships, which reduced transport times drastically. Steam-powered, armor-plated and iron-hulled ships also revolutionized naval warfare in the region. The other major development was the creation of the Suez Canal, which brought Europe much closer to the Indian Ocean region. This surge in naval activity also resulted in an increase in outward migration from India of indentured labor to work in plantations in other colonies. After a gap of many centuries, what you also see is Indian merchants beginning to set up their own trading networks as well. Other parts of Africa were being fought over as well, with the British, French, Germans, Italians and even the Belgians fighting for supremacy in the region. The takeover of Africa happened really fast, and European powers drew arbitrary lines as boundaries for their colonies without consulting local needs, and this has had disastrous consequences for African countries even till today.